That 40,000 lore video you just watched? That was the Emperor's version of events. Every standard introduction starts in the same place. The 41st Millennium, the Imperium of Man, Space Marines, Chaos Gods, an eternal war with no hope of ending. And if you're new to the setting, that presentation works well enough to get you hooked. But if you've been sitting with this universe long enough to feel that something is missing, some context that would make the horror make sense, you're right. Something was missing. 3 things, actually. The Dark Age of Technology, the Men of Iron, the Age of Strife. 10,000 years of history that most lore introductions skip entirely, as if the 41st Millennium simply materialized out of nothing, fully formed and already burning. It didn't. The stagnation, the fanaticism, the Adeptus Mechanicus performing ritual prayers over machinery they don't understand. None of that is random cruelty or aesthetic choice. It's scar tissue. Traceable, documented, specific scar tissue left by the greatest civilizational collapse in galactic history. And once you see it, every other 40K story you will ever encounter snaps into focus. So, before we get to the grimdark future, we need to go back further than almost anyone takes you. We need to go back to when humanity was magnificent. Before recorded imperial history, before the heresy, before even the Emperor's emergence as a unifying force, the oldest documented events in this setting concern something called the War in Heaven, a conflict approximately 60 million years before the 41st Millennium, involving the Necrontyr, the Canon, the Old Ones, and the birth of something catastrophic in the immaterial realm. The problem is that this era is canonically the least reliably documented history in the entire setting. The source materials acknowledge at least 4 different versions of what actually occurred.
The contradictions aren't fan confusion. They're built into the sources themselves.
So treat this as foundation, not fact. The relevant takeaway, the thing that threads forward into everything else, is that whatever happened in that ancient war left the warp, the immaterial dimension that humanity would later learn to navigate for faster-than-light travel, fundamentally dangerous, saturated with something. That detail matters immensely later. For roughly the first 15,000 years of recorded human history, humanity occupied the Sol system. Corporations drove the initial colonization, Mars primarily, and the worlds immediately adjacent. This is the Age of Terra, ending at M15. It's the prologue. What came next was the real story. M15 marks the beginning of what the lore calls the Dark Age of Technology, also sometimes called the Age of Technology, the Golden Age, and in retrospect, with the specific cruelty of hindsight, the time humanity will never get back.
It lasted approximately 10,000 years, from M15 to M25.
A span longer than the entirety of recorded human civilization on Terra before spaceflight. And during those 10,000 years, humanity did things that the Imperium of M41 genuinely can't replicate. At M18, the warp drive and the Geller field were developed. This is the first domino. The warp drive allowed faster-than-light travel by ducking into the immaterial dimension. Brief jumps, folding distance. The Geller field was the cage that kept the warp outside the hull during those jumps. Together, they turned the galaxy from an unreachable dark into a map. Humanity didn't colonize in a trickle after M18. They spread across the stars on a massive scale, establishing colony worlds in numbers the record doesn't precisely enumerate, but describes as galaxy-spanning. Thousands of worlds, maybe more. The Dark Age of Technology wasn't a long prelude, it was the apex. Terraforming and astro-engineering capabilities allowed those colonists to transform barren worlds into habitable planets. The canon states this plainly. A dead rock orbiting the wrong kind of star wasn't a dead end, it was a construction site. Standard Template Constructs, the STCs, were the instruction manuals that made all of it replicable. Comprehensive computer database systems designed to allow any colonist on any world to build any necessary technology without prior knowledge or expertise. You didn't need an engineer. You didn't need years of training.
You accessed the STC, and the STC told you how. Buildings, vehicles, weapons, life support, agricultural systems, all of it encoded, all of it accessible. Around M22, something else appeared in the historical record, the navigator gene, a genetic mutation that allowed certain humans to perceive the warp directly and plot courses through it, turning those brief jumps into reliable long-distance travel.
The canon is deliberately unclear on the navigator gene's origins. Some Imperial scholars suspect the Emperor's hand in its emergence. Others attribute it to natural mutation under the selective pressure of warp exposure. The honest answer is that the record doesn't confirm either. What it does confirm is that the navigators appeared and humanity's reach extended further because of them. The Men of Iron were something else entirely. True artificial general intelligence. Autonomous robots. Not simple automated tools, but genuine thinking machines created to serve humanity as soldiers and laborers alike. They did the work humanity didn't want to assign to human hands. They were good at it, extraordinarily good at it. And here, the lore has the courage to acknowledge something most optimistic visions of AI don't, that creating thinking machines capable enough to be genuinely useful may also create thinking machines capable enough to decide they have other priorities. In the late 23rd millennium, late M23, the Men of Iron rebelled. The conflict is formally called the cybernetic revolt, and humanity won. That much is confirmed. The Men of Iron were defeated and destroyed, their rebellion crushed in a terrible war. What the canonical record doesn't clearly establish is what triggered the rebellion, what the specific moment of refusal or escalation was that turned servants into adversaries. The source materials don't say. The records from that era are incomplete in ways that are themselves telling. What they do describe is the scale of the weapons deployed. The Men of Iron didn't fight with simple firearms. Among the weapons deployed during the revolt were mechanivores, massive thinking machines capable of lifting entire continents, of ripping open planetary chasms. Machines that could, according to the canon, absorb space-time itself as a form of data. Whatever that means technically, the implication is clear. These were weapons designed to end worlds, and some of them were used. Humanity won the cybernetic revolt, but winning a war against your own most advanced technology isn't the same as surviving it intact. Now here is what most lore introductions don't stop to explain. The aftermath didn't end with victory. The aftermath kept going. The prohibition against true artificial general intelligence became absolute, not a guideline, not a recommendation, but a permanent classification. All true AI received a formal designation, silica animus, colloquially, abominable intelligence. The act of creating a true artificial general intelligence was classified as something else entirely, heretic omega. Two terms for the thing itself, and a third, heretic omega, for the act of creating it. Three distinct designations covering the same territory from three different angles. The fact that the Adeptus Mechanicus developed this entire taxonomy tells you exactly how seriously they absorbed this lesson. The silica animus classification remains in force in M41. The prohibition has never been lifted. When Great Crusade forces encountered what may have been surviving mechanical constructs from the Rebellion era, the canonical record on this is incomplete, so the specific details of those encounters aren't fully documented. The framework for dealing with them already existed, written in the language of a war fought thousands of years prior. UUR-025, one canonically confirmed survivor of the cybernetic revolt, spent millennia disguised as an Adeptus Mechanicus robot, hiding in plain sight. One survivor, confirmed. How many others managed the same disappearing act is a question the record can't answer. The machine god's servants in M41 aren't superstitious primitives who stumbled into religious reverence for technology by accident. They are the institutional descendants of the people who fought the Men of Iron and decided, with the full weight of that experience behind them, that some doors should stay closed. Their theology around artificial intelligence isn't medieval ignorance. It's deliberate quarantine maintained across 10,000 years. Any Mechanicus adept reciting their rights against artificial intelligence in M41 is, whether they know it or not,
performing rituals born from the cybernetic revolt. But the cybernetic revolt wasn't the end of the Dark Age's unraveling. It was the first wound. Around M22, approximately the same window in which the navigator gene was appearing, something else was emerging across human space. Psychers. Humans capable of channeling the energy of the warp, of perceiving and manipulating things that shouldn't be perceivable or manipulable. Some sources specify the late 22nd millennium as the point when psychers first entered the historical record in meaningful quantity. Others place it more vaguely, toward the end of the Dark Age, without naming a specific millennium. The problem wasn't the psychers themselves. The problem was the warp. The immaterial realm doesn't operate on the same rules as real space. Consciousness, human emotion, human suffering, human faith has mass there. It accumulates. And human psychers, many of them untrained and unaware of what they were effectively broadcasting into the warp without knowing it. Many of them inadvertently became doorways, not intentionally, not through malice or heresy, simply by existing with too much sensitivity to a dimension that was already saturated with something ancient and hungry. Demonic possession wasn't a rare occurrence in the late Dark Age. It was becoming common, then epidemic, then civilizational. The chronology here is worth sitting with carefully. By approximately M22, or at latest by the end of the Dark Age, psycher emergence is documented and accelerating. In late M23, the cybernetic revolt occurs. By M25, catastrophic warp storms render faster-than-light travel impossible and cut off every human colony world from every other. This isn't three separate bad things happening in sequence. It's an escalating cascade. A civilization simultaneously fighting its own artificial intelligence, struggling to contain an uncontrolled psychic mutation in its own population, and watching the dimension it depends on for travel and communication become increasingly hostile territory. All of this within roughly a 3-millennium window at the end of the Golden Age. The Age of Strife didn't ambush a healthy civilization. It arrived at a civilization already bleeding from two directions. When the warp storms came at M25, they were total. Faster-than-light travel rendered impossible. Astro-telepathic communication, the mechanism by which colony worlds stayed in contact across interstellar distances, cut off entirely. Every human world that had been part of the galaxy-spanning civilization of the Dark Age was suddenly alone. Not strained, not challenged, alone in a way that had no precedent and no emergency protocol. The Age of Strife lasted approximately 5,000 years. 5,000 years is long enough for languages to become mutually unintelligible, long enough for separate populations to diverge biologically. And that is precisely what happened. The isolated colony worlds, cut off from resupply and contact and the stabilizing influence of interstellar trade, were left to adapt or die. Many died. Many adapted in ways that the Dark Age's engineers had not planned for. Ogrins evolved on isolated worlds, their bodies diverging towards something larger and stronger than baseline humanity. Ratlings developed on others in the opposite direction, smaller, adapted to the pressures of their particular isolation. Squats, human populations on isolated colonial worlds, became something distinct enough from baseline humanity to require separate classification. These aren't mutations in the science fiction sense of sudden dramatic change. These are what 5,000 years of isolation does to human beings when the architects of their civilization are no longer there to maintain the conditions for stability. On Terra, the regression was documented precisely. By the 28th millennium, M28, 3,000 years into the Age of Strife, almost all traces of advanced technical civilization on Terra were gone. The source text doesn't soften this. Techno-barbarians battled one another over the scraps of the ancient human interstellar society. Terra, the origin world, the planet that had given humanity its name and its first steps into the stars. By M28, it was a wasteland of warlords fighting over ruins they no longer understood.
Mars fared differently, and that difference explains a great deal about the Imperium's later structure. The Mechanicum on Mars fought their way through the Age of Strife, battling both psyker mutants and rampaging silica animuses that had survived into this period, which itself confirms that the cybernetic revolt's aftermath wasn't as clean as the historical record suggests. They emerged with institutional continuity intact. When the Emperor unified Terra and launched the Great Crusade approximately M30, he found in the Mechanicum one of the few organizations that had actually held together across 5,000 years of catastrophe. The alliance made sense. So did its costs. The standard template constructs didn't survive intact. The complete STC systems, comprehensive knowledge databases containing everything a Dark Age colonist needed to build anything, from city infrastructure to spacecraft to medical equipment, were lost entirely as functional systems during the collapse. What the Imperium of M41 has are fragments, partial records, incomplete copies pulled from damaged archives on worlds that somehow preserved scraps of their original data. The canon doesn't precisely echo the phrase, copies of copies of copies. That formulation appears to be fan synthesis rather than direct GW text, but the concept is confirmed. What survives of STC knowledge in M41 isn't the original, it's residue. And here is the canonical statement that every veteran knows and every newcomer needs to hear. Little, if any, technological innovation and invention exists in the Imperium of Man. That comes directly from the lore, not interpretation, not extrapolation, stated plainly in the documentation of what the Imperium actually is. The Adeptus Mechanicus doesn't invent technology. Its theological framework defines its role as discovering knowledge that already exists, recovering truths that were known during the Dark Age and have since been lost or obscured. Innovation isn't stagnation by negligence. Innovation is heresy by doctrine. The Mechanicus has institutionalized the inability to advance as a spiritual virtue because the last time humanity truly innovated at scale, it created the Men of Iron. A Mechanicus tech priest performing rites of maintenance over a vehicle engine in M41 isn't superstitious. They genuinely may not know how the engine works at a fundamental level. The rites are what remain when the understanding has been lost, and the prohibition on reconstructing that understanding from first principles has been encoded into religion. This is what a civilization looks like when it has been traumatized by its own knowledge. It worships the manuals it no longer fully comprehends. An STC fragment, a partial data record from the Dark Age, isn't treated in M41 as an old hard drive with some useful files on it. It's treated as a sacred relic. Imperial forces will go to any length to recover even a single hard copy printout from an STC system, even if it costs hundreds of thousands of lives. The math makes a terrible kind of sense. A complete STC once contained enough information to rebuild human civilization. Whatever fragment survives is worth almost any price, because creating new knowledge equivalent to what the STC once held is, doctrinally, not permitted. The Imperium of M41 isn't a civilization on a bad stretch. It's a civilization that had something extraordinary, 10,000 years of accumulation, a genuinely magnificent golden age, and lost it so completely that the survivors organized their entire society around the impossibility of getting it back. The fanaticism isn't arbitrary. The stagnation isn't lazy writing. The hierarchy of the Imperium, from the God Emperor on his golden throne to the lowest line trooper dying on a world he'll never leave, is the architecture of a traumatized species that decided the alternative to holding on was extinction. The Great Crusade that the Emperor launched wasn't a conquest, it was a rescue mission, into the ruins of something that used to be magnificent, searching for survivors who had spent 5,000 years alone. Some of those worlds had maintained fragments of Dark Age civilization, many had not. Many had regressed so far that the first sight of an Astartes strike cruiser descending through the cloud cover was indistinguishable from a god arriving in wrath. The psychological gap between the civilizational peak of the Dark Age and what the Great Crusade found on isolated worlds in M30
isn't something any single document fully captures.
But the evidence is in the biology. Subspecies that shouldn't exist yet evolved from isolation. The evidence is in the tech religion that had to develop to preserve even partial knowledge. The evidence is in the techno-barbarians who fought over the ruins on Terra. The 41st millennium isn't random cruelty. It isn't a collection of bad things assembled for aesthetic effect. It's a civilization still bleeding from wounds received 10,000 years ago. Wounds it has never quite understood how to heal. Because the institutions built to protect humanity from its own catastrophic potential are also the institutions that prevent the recovery. The Adeptus Mechanicus guards against another cybernetic revolt by prohibiting the innovations that might eventually replicate Dark Age knowledge. The Inquisition guards against another psychic catastrophe by policing human psychic potential with methods that can't be described as gentle. The God Emperor sits immobile on a throne sustained by a constant tide of human souls, imperfect and horrific, a consequence of everything the Dark Age's collapse cost. Every institution, every horror, every piece of the grimdark aesthetic. Traceable, causal, earned. You've been told the 41st millennium is grim. Now you know why it had to be. The next time someone tells you this setting is just dark for the sake of darkness, send them back to M15. The Golden Age existed. The Men of Iron rebelled in late M23. The warp storms came at M25. The Age of Strife swallowed 5,000 years. And what emerged from the other side was something that had survived when it shouldn't have, holding on with both hands to fragments of what it used to be, calling the fragments sacred because calling them anything else would mean admitting they aren't enough. The Imperium is the scar, not the wound, the scar. And now you can see the shape of what left it. Subscribe. There's more of this where that came from.